In a lot of ways, the order of finishing doesn't wholly matter, so long as it applies the principles that we can hide where we start and end stitches while securing them strongly enough. Most finishers, it seems, use a knot to fasten their thread. I prefer to tag my thread in place, this way I don't have a dense piece of thread. However, I expect it is more likely that it can get pulled out over time. Now, it's practically a case of felling together all of the lining or silicea, which is basted to some other lining or silicea. However, you really want to start with the curtain and pockets, so that the stitches can be fastened up underneath the waistband lining out of sight. We can take the basting out as and when it becomes redundant if we want, reduces the workload later. Felling the rear of the side pockets, the silicea should already be basted properly, so we just need a neat fell. Start at the bottom, fastening the thread on the inlay, preferably on the horizontal, jutting out from the bottom of the pocket 1 cm or so, felling across, then up the folded edge. Again, getting to the curtain, still felling to the trouser inlay if convenient, but no stress if only to the curtain. Fastening the thread under the waistband out of sight. Then the front of the pockets to the curtain, only up to the waistband. That said, on trousers made by better trouser makers than I, these aren't fastened together. I almost suggest you skip this one on both sides and take out the basting. Make sure that the curtain under the front of the trouser goes quite far under the pocket. Also, I suggest pinking shearing the raw edge underneath it. Not stitching these together will reduce the pulling between the pockets and the center fronts. Felling the curtain to the fly is a very simple case of fastening the thread unobtrusively at the bottom and felling the fly up to the curtain, still fastening out of mind under the waistband. We should start felling the waistband near the hook on the bottom. Fasten the thread and make headway towards the first corner of the side nestled in the hook. Start felling up the silicea and we can get only a few stitches before we hit the hook. Go under the hook and under the fabric if possible. And with the recommended standard hook, with the hole, make a couple of stitches in there. Under the hook again, fell up the remainder of the silicea, around the corner to fell all along the waistband. At this point, we're keeping the silicea tight into the cove of said hook. At any point finishing the waistband, we can take out some of the basting in order to move the seam so that we can straighten it, making it more level than maybe it was. At the center back of the waistband where we have the overlap, we don't need to fell that down. There's nothing stopping you, but it's no bother. Leaving it open also gives greater flexibility and ease, so it's under less strain. At the bearer, just finish felling the top of the waistband, fastening the thread underneath the silesia. Do the bottom side of the waistband, starting from underneath the bearer's silesia, and a simple fell all the way across where we started. When we get to the pleats, we should fell through as much of the silesia as possible without straining ourselves, but also tacking the top of the pleat together at the centre back. At the bottom of the fly bearer, start with fastening the bit you folded up behind the fly and guard earlier with a cross stitch. We don't want the stitching to be visible when we look at the inside of the trouser though. I'm cross stitching across, and when I get to the end, I tack the thread before moving on without cutting and starting a new thread. Proceed then to prick stitch the silesia to the seam allowance. We could also, or in lieu of that, fell the guard silesia to the trouser lining. Either way, we do not want the stitching visible on the outside of the trouser. When we become level with the bottom of the curtain, I'm stitching across my folded edge, stitching the silesia to the curtain. Fell upwards, sewing the silesia to the curtain, then the waistband lining. At the top of the waistband, fell across the top of the guard lining to the waistband. Finally, down a little beyond where we cut the machine stitching, securing the thread in place. We chalked where we had cut the seam on the bearer, so we chalked those onto the silesia, but we also know that it starts 2 cm from the outer edge and ends 2 cm beyond that. Chalk the waistband seam onto the silesia as well. We can do a simple baste around the hole, quite far though, because we don't want to interfere when we fold the silesia. We'll cut the silesia like a pocket opening, cutting a small hole in the center and cutting towards both sides of the hole, stopping short to cut the miters. We can make the hole 1 or 1.5 centimeters tall, making sure we have a bit of space before the pressed up seam allowance inside, and only the pressed up seam allowance that we cut is visible through the hole we're making, which is where the chalk markings come in. We need to fold the small amounts of silesia under themselves up to the corners so that we cut so that the raw edges aren't exposed. We need to press them in place since we can't really baste them down. I tried using my scissors here to poke the seams under. We should use our button to check that the hole is big enough before felling the perimeter of the silesia. If there are any more raw edges peeking out, then forcing them away as well. Making sure too that our stitches don't show on the outside of the bearer, that we only fell the silesia to the seam allowances. We are going to cut the waistband seam, so we need to secure either side. Do a bar tack either side of the silesia, ensuring it's nicely aesthetic from the front of the cloth. Once secure, we can cut the hole open, snip the waistband stitching between the tacks open, clearing it away as though it were never sewn. And then a final check that it's big enough for your button. Do up the zip and hook and bar to find the position of the button. Use chalk holding the buttonhole down and mark the point of the bearer's hole furthest away from its trouser. We know the vertical location of the button level with the waistband seam. I'll link off Maurice Sidwell's button video again, so I will gloss over actually attaching the button. We should sew it through as much as possible without sewing through the front of the trouser, since it bears some of the strain of the zip and the catch-on. Also stopping the waistband on the bearer from poking out above the waistband in front of it. Doing up the button and hook to make sure it's in the right place. You'll also fasten the curtain down from inside of the pleats. Secure it to the inlay at the back, to the back pockets, or just the dart as appropriate. Keep the tacks quite subtle. Now we'll prick stitch the pocket opening. You can do these little bits when they first come up, but it's better for me to structure this doing it as a finishing section. Get scud of any thread markings that are in the way. Start with a bar tack at the top or the bottom of the pocket. Stitch through everything, giving either side of the bar maximum purchase to hold the two together. Coil the thread around the bar gently, pulling the thread away from where you started. Finishing the bar and starting the prick stitch up the pocket opening, maybe ½ centimeter from the edge. The prick isn't just for decoration, it's to hold and set the edge. It will stop the facing from peeking out from behind the front of the trouser, in the exact same way that the basting is holding it now. Prick stitching, make sure you catch through the facing, otherwise it's half worthless. Bar tack the other end of the pocket and fasten the thread somehow neatly. Clear any remaining thread marks and basting for just neatening it up. For the J-stitch, secure the thread out of the way on the inside. Just prick stitch along the line we chalked, fixing the fly to the front trouser. When we get to the bottom of this seat seam, where the J-stitch will be ending, we will do a bar tack in order to keep the two fronts securely together. Make a few bar stitches across everything and coil it off nicely. Send the needle to the reverse to secure and hide it as discreetly as possible underneath the fly bearer thing. On the fly side, on the center front, we need to prick stitch down to the notch. Start at the waistband and bar tack between the waistband and the fabric. Tack through everything to make the bar and coil around it. Prick stitch right along the edge all the way down to the notch and secure the thread. Again, like the pockets, it's to fix the seam so that it stays bled into the off side and doesn't become visible at any point. So we need to sew through all the layers and fix them together properly. At the bottom, secure and hide the thread anywhere you happen to see fit. We need to prick stitch the fabric down to the zip on the bearer side. Fasten the fabric somewhere discreetly at the top of the waistband. Send the needle to the front, right along the edge of the folded fabric. Prick stitch the fabric to the zip tape. It doesn't really matter if we take more or less, but we don't want this stitch to be visible from the back. When we get to the bottom, again, we're just securing the thread discreetly. Similarly to the center front, we need to prick stitch the edge of the bearer starting from where the waistband meets the bearer, again doing a bar tack between the two. Do a similar prick stitch along the edge to the bottom of the bearer. We can fasten it behind the bearer and the fly where we cross-stitched it earlier. Anywhere that happens to take your fancy, really. We need to bar tack the fly and bearer together. Just sew a bar tack near the bottom of the fly and bearer, I'd say about level with the bottom stop of the zip. Since I chose a hole and button or H&B closure for my back pocket, I need to sew the buttonhole and sew on the button. You can reference mine or any buttonhole video, but this serves as an example of how I might start and end a buttonhole in an actual garment, and I suppose specifically in a back pocket. To make sure the button goes on correctly, I lay the trouser flat and the pocket closed, and mark through the hole where the keyhole is onto the bearer, giving it its purpose. Again, there's a sewing on buttons video linked in the description so that I can gloss over sewing the button on. We need to detack the hip pocket, no differently to how we've detacked any time before. To sew up the hem, knot the end of the thread and start at the peak of the folded triangle, securing the thread underneath the fold. Fell up that seam without catching through the outside of the fabric. From the top, I'm tucking the thread before doing the hem, or blanket stitch from Hand Stitches Part 1. Again, there's no such thing as too dense, but there is a point of diminishing results, and there's how long it'll take you to do it. About 1 centimeter between them is good. You could probably get away with more for tweed and denser for finer fabrics, because of course we're taking less of the fabric, so we'll just take more lesses, right? When we hem across the inlays and seam allowances, we can just stitch to the seam allowance and inlays and don't need to take as much care to take as little as possible since it doesn't show through. We can keep going around like that until we make it back to the start. Make sure to stitch over the slightly overlapped portion where we folded the triangle and secure the thread, proceeding to hide the tail of the thread. At the fork, you'll fasten the seam allowances and sticky out bit of the inside leg inlay to the inside leg inlay. Sew the seam allowances to the inlay too, and don't catch the outside of the trouser. If the pieces are overlocked, then we can cross stitch over following the 1/2 centimeter seam that is overlocked. We'll almost always cover the fork with something, so aesthetic it does not need to be. We could trim down the side seam inlay that's sticking out from the seam allowance, or just cross-stitch it with the rest of the inlay. Cross-stitch both sides, obviously, without catching the outside trouser fabric, only stitching the seams to the inlay and seam allowance. We can skip over the seam instead of starting and ending 2 different stitches. It's a kind of principle of saving a few seconds with each project adding up over time. If you do this for a living, in my situation though, it almost doesn't matter. On the top of the fork, we need to make a square of lining, with a piece of lining about 16 by 30 centimeters, folded in half inside out, or enough to create about a 14 by 14 centimeter square. Essentially, measure from under the fly to the inside leg seams. Double that, and that's about the dimensions of the square you want. Close almost all the seams so that it can be folded right side out, which will be felled closed. Iron it flat with the seams on the inside. Place the square onto the fork with the first corner hidden up underneath the fly and bearer. Tack it to the seam allowances there. Then, the diametrically opposing corner, tack it to the back trouser inlay, but we need to make sure there's enough slack. Maybe hold it in a position on the seam allowance and pull it every which way so that you know whether it would pull. If it doesn't, then tack it to the seam allowances there too. Following that, either side to the inside leg seam allowances, following the same principles. We need to remove all of the basting and marks that we want to get rid of before we iron our trousers, and any chalk markings for that matter. We can spray a small amount of water on the chalk and use a toothbrush to get rid of the marks. We could also use a cloth brush or just be ghetto and use a scrap of the same cloth to rub it off. If we used wax chalk, then we'll just iron the markings away. There's an unlisted uncut version of ironing in the video description. Lay the trouser legs folded on the creases we already made. Gently fold the first leg up out of the way. Start with the hem, which should be flat, but we are reinforcing and really trying to cement the crease, moving up the center front crease again. I move the slanted pocket bag out of the way of the seam so that I can press the front creases all the way up. Again, I want to press in the back crease, positioning the cloth in the same way that I did the first time, using something to hold the front crease flat and drawing both sides of the cloth towards the center back, making sure they're as flat together as possible, pressing the back crease again. If we moved it and didn't do it right the first time, then we'll wet the cloth to remove the old crease and put in the new crease to a little above the seat seam. Gently flip the trouser over and press the other side of the trouser in the same way, following which we need to change legs. More importantly, to gently fold away the ironed leg away. And I spent a few minutes trying to remember which side I just ironed. If we had shaped the legs, we can do it again, stretch out the calf and thigh again, and shrink in the shin and hamstring again. Iron up the seam, being careful and using a press cloth, otherwise the inlay and overlocking is liable to get marked onto the leg. Turn the leg over and press it flat on the other side. At a few points I used some water and sprayed onto the trouser to get rid of some train tracks and give myself some strong creases. Also, I tried getting rid of a stain with some cloth soap, but the soap wouldn't melt under the iron, and I didn't go and get a warm damp cloth. So it's still there at the end. It did come off though, with the stain by the way. Of course, we need to iron around the top of the trouser as well, and it'd be advantageous to use a tailor's ham or sleeve board, while still ideally making use of your sacrificial cotton. Usually we can get by without the cloth, and I am here for the sake of visibility. Get each section steamy, but not necessarily wet, but not necessarily not wet, and use the heat of the iron to dry it off. Be sure that everything is laying flat, that the pockets and curtains are flat, and that all the seams are properly open. Just work around the whole trouser, just below and on the waistband. From the inside as well, we need to iron the waistband, pockets, and curtain. When putting it on a hanger, we need to preserve the front and back creases, making sure that the point of contact of the trouser to the hanger is flat. Which might sound pretentious to say out loud, but it is what you need to do to preserve the pristine cloth and the paper test worthy creases we have.